The Robber Bridegroom from Grimm's Complete Fairy Tales. And my phone's making noises at me. Thought I had that turned off. Oh no, well. Anyway, The Robber Bridegroom from Grimm's Fairy Tales. There was once on a time a miller who had a beautiful daughter, and she was grown up. He wished that she was provided for and well married. Though, if any good suitor comes and asks for her, I will give her to him. Not long afterwards, a suitor came, who appeared to be very rich, and as the miller had no fault to find in him, he promised his daughter to him. The maiden, however, did not like him quite so much as a girl should like a man to whom she was engaged, and she had no confidence in him. Whenever she saw him or thought of him, she felt a secret horror. Once he said to her, "Thou art my betrothed, and thou hast never once paid me a visit." The maiden replied, "I know not where thy house is." Then the bridegroom, "My house is out there in the dark forest." She tried to excuse herself, and she said she could not find her way there. The bridegroom said, "Next Sunday thou must come out there to me. I have already invited the guests, and I will strew ashes in order that thou mayest find thy way through the forest." When Sunday came, and the maiden had set out on her way, she became very uneasy. She herself knew not exactly why, and to where her mark may well be fueled, with both her pockets full of peas and lentils. The ashes were strewn at the entrance of the forest, and these she followed. But at every step she threw a few peas on the ground. She walked almost the whole day until she reached the middle of the forest, where it was the darkest, and there stood a solitary house, which she did not like, for it looked so dark and dismal. She went inside it, but no one was within, and the most absolute stillness reigned. Suddenly a voice cried, turn back, young maiden dear! 'Tis a murderer's house you enter here." The maiden looked up, and saw that the voice came from a bird, which was hanging in a cage on the wall. Again it cried, turn back, young maiden dear! 'Tis a murderer's house you enter here." Then the young maiden went on farther from room to room, and walked through the whole house. But it was entirely empty, and not one human being was to be found. At last she came to the cellar, and there sat an extremely aged woman who shook her head constantly. "Can you tell me," said the maiden, "if my betrothed lives here?" "Alas, poor child," replied the old woman, "whither hast thou come? Thou art in a murderer's den. Thou thinkest thou art a bride soon to be married, but thou wilt keep thy wedding with death. Look, I have been forced to put on the great kettle on there, with the water in it, and when they have thee in their power, they will cut 3 pieces without mercy, cook thee, and eat thee, for they are the eaters of human flesh. If I do not have compassion on thee and save thee, thou art lost." Thereupon the old woman led her behind the great hogshead, where she could not be seen.
"Be still as a mouse," said she. "Do not make a sound or move, or all will be over with thee. At night, when the robbers are asleep, we will escape. I have long waited for an opportunity."
Hardly was this done than the godless crew came home. They dragged with them another young girl. They were drunk, and paid no heed to her screams and lamentations. They gave her wine to drink, 3 glasses full, 1 glass of white wine, 1 glass of red, and a glass of yellow. With this her heart burst in twain. Thereupon they tore off her delicate raiment, laid her on a table, and cut her beautiful body in pieces, and strewed salt thereon. She needed salt. The poor bride behind the cask trembled and shook, for she saw right well what fate the robbers had destined for her. One of them noticed a gold ring on the little finger of the murdered girl, and as it would not come off at once, he took an axe and cut off the finger. But it sprang up in the air and ran away to the cask, and fell straight into the bride's bosom. The robber took a candle and wanted to look for it, but could not find it. Another of them said, "Hast thou looked behind the great hogshead?" But the old woman cried,
"Come and get something to eat, and leave off looking till the morning. The finger won't run away from you."
Then the robber said, "The old woman is right," and gave up their search and sat down to eat. And the old woman poured a sleeping draught into their wine, so that they soon lay down in the cellar and slept and snored. When the bride heard that, she came out from behind the hogshead, and had to step over the sleepers, for they lay in rows on the ground, and great was her terror lest she should waken even one of them. But God helped her, and she got safely over. The old woman went up with her, opened the doors, and they hurried out of the murderer's den with all the speed in their power. The wind had blown away the strewn ashes, but the peas and lentils had sprouted and grown up, and showed them the way in the moonlight. They walked the whole night, until in the morning they arrived at the mill, and then the maiden told her father everything exactly as it had happened. When the day came when the wedding was to be celebrated, the bridegroom appeared, and the miller had invited all his relations and friends. As they sat at the table, each was bidden to relate something. The bride sat still and said nothing. Then the bridegroom said to the bride, "Come, my darling, dost thou know nothing? Relate something to us like the rest." She replied,
"Then I will relate a dream. I was walking alone through the wood, and at last I came to a house in which no living soul was. But on the wall there was a bird in a cage, which cried, 'Turn back, here, maiden dear, 'tis a murderer's house you enter here.' And then it cried once more, 'My darling, I only dreamt this.' Then I went through all the rooms, and they were all empty, and there was something so horrible about them. At last I went down into the cellar, and there sat a very old woman whose head shook. I asked her, 'Does my bridegroom live in this house?' She answered, Alas, poor child, thou hast got into a murderer's den. Thy bridegroom does live here, and he will hew thee to pieces and kill thee, and then he will cook thee and eat thee. My darling, I only dreamt this, but the old woman hid me behind the great hogshead, and scarcely I was hidden. When the robbers came home, dragging a maiden with them, to whom they gave 3 kinds of wine to drink, white, red, and yellow, which her heart broke into twain. My darling, I only dreamt this, and one of the robbers saw that there was still a ring on her little finger, and it was hard to draw off. He took an axe and cut it off. But the finger sprang up into the air, and sprang behind a great hogshead, and fell in my bosom. And there's the finger with the ring.
And with these words she drew it forth, and showed it to those present. The robber, who had during the story become as pale as ashes, leapt up and wanted to escape, but the guests held him fast, and delivered him over to justice. Then he and his whole troop were executed for their infamous deeds.